Good morning. My name is Leslie Polgar. My pronouns are he and his. My first lay summer sermon's title was, "Are you sure?" "Certainly." As I was preparing it for the First Universalist Church of West Hartford, Connecticut in 1977, I sought advice. It was brief and wise. Avoid reports, especially about books, vacation trips, and cooking. With recent events, we might avoid two more topics: what I did during the pandemic and political views. You know that in a career of startup tech companies, most of which failed, I had to be a risk taker. So, out of habit, if not honor, I will embrace the risk by combining all of these forbidden topical fruits. Today's trip naturally starts at a point. We'll go back in history to discern our track, and then we'll take a road trip on blue highways through some red states. Fasten your seatbelts, please. You might imagine that somewhere during 3 million air miles that I flew from practically commuting to Japan, Scotland, England, and a bit less often to France and Germany, I would have missed some connections. Actually, there was just one, at Baltimore, Washington, known as BWI Airport, at about the same time as that long ago first summer sermon. Today, my thoughts are about another kind of missed connection, those arising from the pandemic and other upheavals. The pandemic has shrunk me. From my physics training, I am reminded of a collapsing black hole, a singularity. We have shrunk into isolated points without connection. Zoom, Skype, Google Hangout, and Microsoft Teams are modern marvels. We all used them, and we still do, but they are not enough. For those of us who need to sense, to notice a brief glance, a facial expression, a barely audible and most of all, to feel a human touch, connection, we need more than a bunch of small picture frames of two-dimensional faces on a screen, no matter how big its diagonal. And the audio on these platforms is even worse. It flunks simultaneous conversations. Before I could possibly escape from my shrunken black hole pandemic self and reconnect with my fellow humans, I had to connect with myself. I had to grow. So I started to make sourdough bread a year ago. I warned you. Bonnie DeLotte, founder of the Worship Associates here at Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church, provided the sourdough starter, loaned me a recipe book, and above all, provided inspiration. Thank you, Bonnie. And I have grown. 54 loaves and 51 weeks later, I am no longer a point, more like a sphere. I especially like the sourdough with diced sun-dried tomatoes, roasted garlic, and basil. Now I was ready to move outward. Geometry and sailing experience have taught me that to chart a course, you need to reconnect with where you had been to get a track. How did we get here? To this fine pickle of a situation of pestilence in every sense, medical, social, and political? I needed to understand. I did this by reading, especially history and biography, lots of it, averaging a book a week, almost as many books as sourdough loaves. And to my surprise, I found that I enjoyed reading books on my iPhone. Surprised because 20 years ago, in a keynote talk in New York City at the Text 10 conference, whose subject was the then emerging electronic book, I fearlessly predicted that it does not have much of a future. For those who may be interested, my latest high-tech stock tips are available. I have to actually read books. Audiobooks go in one ear, out the other, with the dwell time between my ears measurable in nanoseconds. I'm a visual guy. Happily, the Contra Costa Library has a great collection of ebooks. So I reread James Baldwin's classic, The Fire Next Time, followed by Eddie Glaude Jr.'s appraisal, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. Baldwin in 1963 and Glaude in 2020 made me realize that whatever gains we had achieved in civil rights during my adulthood were not enough. I dug deeper to find out about what I thought to be our first civil rights movement, the abolition of slavery. So I read the massive Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David Blight. There is an ironic twist in Blight's account. Those advocating for the abolition of slavery in the South were sometimes at odds with those advocating for civil rights in the so-called free states of the North. I had not realized that. But the most important of the histories I read by far was Kate Masur's 2021 magisterial work, Until Justice Be Done, America's first civil rights movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. Oh, there was a civil rights movement in the USA prior to mid-19th century? I had no idea. Of all the books that helped me to discern what our history has been, this was the most important. Above all, I learned that it took a persistent and sustained alliance between Black activists and white reformers to make progress in securing civil rights in the so-called free states in the era before slavery was abolished. Masur's history taught me how similar our current situation is to what happened 2 centuries ago, and even that an only slightly smaller version of the Tulsa 1921 riots occurred in Cincinnati, Ohio, in September of 1841. Masur writes that Ohio was the main stage on which repression and progress battled each other. Northeast Ohio, where I grew up, went to high school, Ohio was Connecticut's Western Reserve. Ohio was a territory and not a state in 1787 when the Northwest Ordinance of the Confederation Congress abolished slavery in the territories. But in 1803, Ohio gained statehood, and soon thereafter it enacted onerous laws limiting Black migration, settlement, and testimony in courts. Indiana and Illinois would soon follow suit. Remember, these were the free states. My middle school and high school civics and history courses in one of Ohio's best public school districts, Cleveland Heights, failed to teach me the history I learned from Masur's book. So I began now to get a glimmer of one element of what systemic racism might be about. In his 1982 book, Blue Highways, the Native American writer William Least Heat Moon observes, with a nearly desperate sense of isolation and a growing suspicion that I lived in an alien land, I took to the road in search of places where change did not mean ruin and where time and men and deeds connected. Sue and I have always loved road trips. We have driven cross-country round trips 4 times and cross-country driving one way and flying home once. 6 weeks ago, we flew to North Carolina. We rented a car and reconnected with about a dozen sets of friends and relatives in 6 states. The convoluted 1,400-mile drive from Raleigh, North Carolina to St. Louis, Missouri took us to 10 states. As often as feasible, we took some non-interstate routes, blue highways. And we visited two places we had never been, Richmond, Virginia, and Louisville, Kentucky. Of our destinations, it is Indiana, though, that I want to describe. We visited Joel and Sarah McGill. They live in Brownstown, Indiana, near the Kentucky border. We shared a duplex in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with the McGills a half-century ago. He was doing his residency after his MD, and I was doing my PhD dissertation. They moved to Brownstown in 1972 on assignment for the U.S. Public Health Service, and they stayed. Although political liberals to this day, they live in Jackson County, Indiana, which voted 75% for the orange-haired candidate in 2020. Joe was the town's physician and helped build their hospital. They are active in their community, leading the local stage theater company for decades. The McGills have found a way to live and interact in civility with their red-voting fellow citizens, and they have not compromised their liberal values. So for me, the McGills are heroes. And I reflected about Least Heat Moon's description of being in an alien land and how hard it had to be. The experience also got me to drill down on Indiana and the 2020 elections. There are 92 counties in Indiana, which show up on the state map like a sea of red with 5 blue islands. 2 of these blue islands are the 2 most populous counties, Lake County in the northwest corner, very near Chicago, and Marion County, where Indianapolis is located. The other 3 counties are St. Joseph, Tippecanoe, and Monroe. These are home, respectively, to the University of Notre Dame, Purdue University, and Indiana University. This got me to thinking that how our fellow citizens see things might be largely determined by the absence or presence of educational and job opportunities, not some inherently lamentable philosophy or religion. And that insight gives me hope for the future. Happily, I am not alone in hope. Martin Luther King Jr. finished his Ware lecture in 1966 with these words: "With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. But to accomplish that, let us behave as brothers and sisters." Shalom.